The river smelled of iron and wet wood. Under the twins, the waters were swollen and brown, sliding past the pilings with a low, ceaseless murmur. A sound like breathing in sleep. Caitlin Tully felt it in her bones, the moment their column crested the last hummocked rise, and the castle towers heaved themselves up from the wind-bent reeds. Two stony faces watching each other across the flow, linked by the covered bridge with its wooden ribs and the banners that hung limp and damp from the rafters. Men muttered and horses tossed, catching the river's scent and the line of archers on the parapets. The day had not yet chosen between rain and sun. The light was the color of old pewter. Walder Frey counts time different than other men. The Blackfish sat at her side. Sir Brynden sat his horse straight as a spear, his graying beard neat even after the long ride, the fish of River Run on his cloak washed clean by last night's drizzle. "We are late before we hail the gate. We are late because my son is a king," Caitlin said, as much to remind herself as to answer him. Her fingers were stiff under their gloves. Ahead, the direwolf banners pricked through the mist. Gray on white. The men shouted when Robb's standard came into view above the rippling field of spear points, and the sound rippled back like the river's own murmur. He rode near the van with the Great John. Fur collar turned up against the wind, with gray wind pacing. A gray shadow with yellow eyes that cut to the guard towers, and then to her, briefly, as if to be sure she was still there. "I remember when Lord Walder would have opened at a word from my father," she said. "I remember him thin as a heron, waiting 3 hours in River Run's yard, because he had not come when he was summoned. And I remember him counting the cups at supper and making a note of every slice of roast," Sir Brynden said. "He will want the price of each plank in that bridge." Caitlin thought of another bridge, of men on their knees in her father's hall, of swords striking stone, and her throat closed. She drew her cloak closer. There was no warmth to be had from the day or the river, and little enough to be had from the walls that belonged to the Lord of the Crossing. The Freys were looking down on them like cats in windows. Robb turned in his saddle when she and her uncle joined him, and for a heartbeat he was the boy whose hair she had smoothed with wet hands after he fell in the Godswood chasing Bran. Then the iron came back into his face, the knot at his mouth. He inclined his head to her. The Great John boomed some greeting that washed away in the wind. Gray wind came up close enough for her mare to flatten her ears, then fell back at a whistle. "Mother," Robb said. The crown of bronze and iron-wrought leaves sat uneasily on his hair. It always made him look older than the face beneath it, as if the metal had weight enough to drag the boyhood away. "We have sent the herald. Lord Walder will meet me at the gate, and he will make you speak long and wait longer," the Blackfish said. "Do not let him turn you into a supplicant at your own crossing." "I will not," Robb said, and looked then over the river, where the bridge's shuttered windows made rows of black eyes. "But I will not fight for planks and posts. Our men would drown before they were shot." "And oh, they will open," Caitlin said. She forced her hand still on the reins. "Because we will pay what they ask, and because you will honor what you promised." Robb's jaw worked. "I will." He said it like a sentence given, and in some way it was. A lord's word was the mortar that held the world from slipping. She had taught him this when he was small and wanted to chase hounds all morning and eat honey all night. Now promises were bridges, and men died when they fell into rivers. The herald returned sodden and satisfied, his Frey escort pale with the dusk of being kept outside. Trumpets brayed from the gatehouse, and the covered passage yawned. No cat ever smiled wider than Walder Frey when he stood in his tower yard to receive them. He was older than Caitlin remembered. How could he not be? And yet he was not more diminished, only sharper for being worn thin. Bone-skinny in a coat that was too rich, and a collar that sat too high. A long beak of a nose over a mouth that could not keep from sneering even when it pretended to speak fair. Children swarmed around him in a disheveled court. Sons with Frey noses and Frey eyes. Grandsons already turned mean with expectation. Girls in drab gowns, bastards with their hair scraped. Behind them, his older sons stood like stakes in a fence. Ryman with his face gone fat and wine-bloomed. Merritt with the look of a man whose boots always pinched. Lame Lothar bent on his stick and sharp as a fox with a broken leg. Black Walder leaned against a post, all sinew and insolence. The Freys were a river silt, forever laying down another layer, a delta of pale faces. "You are late," Lord Walder said by way of welcome. "And you are wet. The river does that. You are not so pretty as your father was, boy." "Ha! Where's he?" "Ah, yes, he keeps bad company these days." Caitlin stepped forward before the great Joan's laughter could turn dangerous. She curtsied and gave a river-run courtesy with no warmth spared for it at all. "Lord Walder, we thank you for your hospitality. We have ridden long and much, and we are grateful for your gait." He sucked his teeth and peered at her. "Hoster's daughter. Still pretty. Ha! He owes me a visit, your father. He owes me words he did not say when he should have said them. Well? Time wraps around a man's ankles. It will do for him, as it has always done. I see you have brought me a king. Then, so. I am Robb Stark of Winterfell," Robb said, and his voice carried past the yard and up the dark stair to where the Frey women looked down with their hands white on the ledges. "By right of conquest and the acclamations of the North and of the Trident, I am come to pass," Lord Walder chuckled, "and to wed." The yard buzzed like a hive at the lifting of a lid. Caitlin waited for the sting that would come. She felt each fretted word move in her belly. She remembered the night in the tent when Robb, too tired for guile, told her what he had promised to buy the crossing of the twins. One girl from the Lord of the Crossing's brood for the king in the North's bride. He had spoken it like a duty already done. But she had seen the boy in him crease his brow at the thought of a nameless girl in his bed. She had told him duty was a bed that every lord lay in, and he had not flinched. Now the bed waited up the tower with half the Freys ready to throw him into it like a sack. "I am come to wed," Robb said, and the great Joan's hand found his shoulder with a squeeze that said a dozen things at once. "And to pass." "You shall have both," Lord Walder said. His eyes flicked to the direwolf at Robb's stirrup and away, not liking to admit that he had flinched. "We must make you kin before we make you neighbor, else my bridge might break from shame." Come, come. You will meet the girl. Roslin, daughter one, third daughter of my second wife. Sweet girl. Very sweet. Her mother was a prude. Makes them sweet. Bow. He led them through the press and up the steep stair with a speed that belied his years. And the Freys flowed around them so that Caitlin felt, for a moment, as if she were being moved, not by her own legs, but by a current. The twins smelled of boiled meat and old rushes, and the oil of the lamps that flickered in their brackets. The wind banged a shutter somewhere. In the hall, the tapestries were worn thin as hair, showing ghosts of hunts and of stags with broken antlers. Hoster had teased Walder for those when both men were young. She felt the pinch of an old jibe returned as the Lord of the Crossing gestured to a slight girl standing beneath a window, where the light fell palely. Roslin Frey was small and pale as milk, with a face that would have been lost among her sisters, if not for the spread of grief or fear across it like a bruise. She curtsied when she was presented, and then again, lower, when Robb took 2 steps and stopped. He looked at her as one looks at a brook that he must cross in winter, measuring for depth, for stones beneath, for whether he would be swept. His mouth moved, and he gave his mother a tiny glance that would have charmed her if it had not been so grown. Like a boy asking to run farther, like a man asking for the word that would make his feet move. She nodded because there was nothing else to do. "Lady Roslin," Robb said, "I thank you for the kindness of this house." Roslin lifted her head and swallowed. Her eyes were the washed blue of sky seen through cloud. "Your Grace," she said, "you are welcome to my father's roof. We will make you welcome." Her voice did not let her say "I will." It was too small for that, and yet in it was a steadiness that surprised Caitlin and tightened her throat. She thought of Sansa, who had been taught to sing pretty and smile prettier, and of Arya, who would have scowled and asked for a blade. Roslin's courtesy held a tremor and a core all the same, like a reed that bends and will not break. Walder Frey clapped his knobbled hands. "Sweet, as I said. She plays the harp. I. Ha ha. Well, it is settled. We shall have the sept prepared, and the bedding, and the feast. I keep a pig against my heart for such days. We will crack him open and see what spills. Lothar, see to it. Do not let the cooks steal the crackling. They have hands like frogs. Done? Lame Lothar bowed, his smile thin, his eyes already calculating. Caitlin thought of lists being made, of cuts of meat sentenced to this table rather than that. Ryman Frey was already calling for wine, and Black Walder was saying something obscene behind a broad grin. The Great John barked laughter that covered it. Roose Bolton was a pale stone in a corner, saying nothing at all, watching. If he had been anywhere else, he would have been somewhere else entirely. It was his way. Roose had the talent of thinning himself until people forgot to look at him. His eyes were bruised fruit. They were given chambers that smelled of dried herbs and damp, with a jug of river water and cups that sweated against the chill. Caitlin sat and took off her gloves and laid them neatly, as if symmetry could make the day stay in its lines. Outside, she heard the rush of men's voices hurrying to become kin and to become hosts. The river never stopped its low, dreaming breath. When the septi bells rang, she walked at Robb's side. The Freys came like a school of fish, darting and turning their faces toward where the light struck, full of fluttering and looks. Roslin descended the stair with her hands folded in her sleeves, and the look of someone trying to dismount a cantering horse without falling. Walder Frey snapped at his sons and at the septon, at the boys who bore the candles, at the girl who had a loose curl. He scolded the bells for ringing wrong. He scolded the river for rushing. He did not scold Robb. He looked at Grey Wind only from the corner of his eye. The sept itself was small and damp, and crowded by the sheer number of Freys who had to see everything. The stranger's crystalline face was cracked. Robb's sword looked too real for the place. It absorbed what little light there was until it glowed dully. Caitlin did not hear the words so much as she felt the shape of them pass around her. The old vows, the words that wedding gowns were cut to, the turnings of a daughter into a wife and a son into a husband. She saw Robb lift the cloak and settle it on Roslin's shoulders, direwolf gray falling over Frey blue, wool over silk. Roslin's shoulders were narrow and bare, and they shook only once when the weight came down. She looked up at him and smiled, small as a candle tip, but there. She had delicate hands, Caitlin noted. Sansa's had been like that. Arya's hands had always had scabs. When the septon bid them kiss, Robb leaned, and Roslin leaned, and the hall breathed. Somewhere, a Frey girl began to cry, and a Frey boy laughed, and the Grey Jones booming was as gentle as he could make it. Roose Bolton did not move. Feasts at the twins tasted of smoke and salt. They served thick, fat slices of the pig that Lord Walder had kept against his heart, and capon stuffed with onions, and river fish laid in lines with lemon slices like moons. The Lord of the Crossing oversaw the carving with the fierce attention of a miser counting coin, pointing where to cut, what went on what trencher. He had a crab generosity, which perhaps is no generosity at all, and yet it fed a great many mouths. The Grey John drank and drank again, and plucked 3 girls into his lap by turns, and Mage Mormont roared when one of the Frey men took liberties she had not invited. Sir Wendell Manderly laughed till he choked on a piece of crackling, then laughed again. Harp strings thrummed at one end of the hall. Caitlin saw that Roslin's fingers, when she could be made to play, were deft and shy. The music ran like the river and got lost beneath the din. It is well, Caitlin told herself, and found that she believed it as much as she could believe anything. Robb laughed when the Grey John made some coarse joke, and then his laugh fell, and his glance strayed to the girl who by the laws of gods and men was his wife. He leaned to say something to Roslin between songs, and the girl nodded once, twice, and answered too soft for anyone else to hear. Walder Frey watched his grandchildren squabble over a sugared plum, as if it were a map of all the world's wars. Roose Bolton did not laugh and barely ate. He watched the torches, and the torches watched him back, and guttered. The bedding came, as it always came, with hoots and hands, the ancient way that made a ritual of embarrassment, that wrapped a couple in laughter and taken cloth until there was nothing left to do but be husband and wife. Naked beneath the calls and the verses that everyone pretended not to hear. Caitlin gripped her cup and stared into the dregs. She had been bedded once, on a night that was full of flowers in her memory, and of tenderness, and then of duty. She tried to remember if she had been more afraid then than she was now. She rose before anyone thought to drag her to the bedchamber with the others. She would not be part of it. When she reached the corridor, the music still pinched thinly from the hall after her. A girl with Frey eyes ran past her giggling, clutching an armful of linens, the froth of them trailing like a bridal veil. Outside in the yard the air was colder. One of the towers was a black tooth against the cloud-flecked sky. The river breathed and breathed as if it had never known drought. Men came to the edge of the bridge to piss and to laugh face down at the water. Their voices carried and fell like stones. She went to the parapet where the damp had grown moss, and she put her hands on the rough and felt the grit bite her skin. Her father would have scolded her for being outside without a cloak, and then given her his own to turn his scolding into love. She wished for River Run with a sudden sharpness that made her sway. A footfall sounded behind her, quiet. She did not turn. "Lord Bolton," she said. "You and I are alike in that we need less company than most." Pale eyes slid into the corner of her sight. "My lady," Roose Bolton said. His voice made steam in the cold, and then it was gone. "The Freys keep a well-ordered house. They keep a crowded one," she said. "Today that is well. Today we wanted witnesses." "Witnesses are currency," Roose said. "Lord Frey has much of that currency and spends it grudgingly. He thinks himself a banker. He will expect interest. He has just had a queen," she said, before remembering that was not the word the Riverlands used. Her boy was a king, and his wife was a queen only in the north, and everything here had two names and two prices. He has had a king for a son by marriage. He will want more than words, yes. "The crossing will be free," Roose said, as if she had asked. "He is a man with a shop. He understands that when a prince comes to buy bread, one gives him the loaf but charges him dear for the butter and the knife." "You think so little of men," Catelyn said. Roose Bolton looked at the water. "I think of men the size they are. It keeps my belly full." "No." A woman's laughter jutted from a window above and broke into fragments on the stone. Catelyn bit the inside of her lip until she tasted a little blood. "You have a son," she said. "I see him little. I see his bastard more. He is a loud young man." Roose's mouth flattened into what might have been a smile. "I have a true-born son at the Dreadfort," he said. "He is gentle." He did not make any of it a question or a boast. He said gentle, as one would say, lamb or a fly. "Sometimes gentleness is gift," she said. "Sometimes," Roose Bolton said, and bowed his head with a particular grace that made her skin crawl, because it was like a blade taken from a sheath, quiet and intent. "I wish the king joy." He drifted away like a wraith and was gone. Catelyn wrapped her arms around herself until her bones felt less likely to rattle. Across the courtyard someone sang a snatch of a bawdy song about a fisherman and his net. Below, the river went on being the river. She went back inside because standing in the cold did not change the shape of the night. Robb and Roslin did not show themselves until morning. The hall smelled of spilled wine and tallow, and a great many bodies that had too little soap between them. Lord Walder was awake enough to be twice as sharp and twice as pleased with himself. He greeted her with a crooked gentility, crooned something about grandchildren with wolf eyes, and then shouted at Merritt for a stain on the table. Roslin appeared behind a pair of bustling aunts, her hair in a simple braid, her gown plain, her eyes downcast. The flush in her cheeks might have been from the cold. She curtsied and called Catelyn mother, the word placed carefully on her tongue so that it would not break. "Daughter," Catelyn said and kissed her brow. The girl smelled faintly of rosewater and of something else, like Camden's horn comb when it had heated at the fire. Bone and oil and something a little sweet. Robb came with the Great John and a trail of lords like a wake. He was not the boy who had blushed at a kiss in Winterfell's cellar to make Arya shriek and laugh. He was the king grown by a night, or perhaps duty had only put its hand more firmly on his shoulder. He kissed his wife's knuckles and said something that made her look at him and hold his gaze for a heartbeat. More than courtesy demanded. There was wonder in that look and fear. and Caitlin saw in it a seed that might be watered or starved. She prayed then, not to all the seven, whose faces were cracked and dim, but to the old gods of the trees, whose faces were in the heartwood of Winterfell, and would not turn at a prayer uttered under another roof. She prayed for the shape of that seed. Terms were inked and sealed before noon. Lord Walder produced them like a conjurer or a grocer. Promises written plain and in small script. Obligations that ran long as the bridge planks. Enforcement like the nails that held them. In return for the marriage and the kingly kinship, the Freys pledged their levy and their bridge, and the certainty that there would not be a knife hidden in the sausage. In return, they would be honored and kept and given place. Robb bore it soberly. Caitlin watched lame Lothar's quill carve lines into parchment, and knew those lines dug into more than paper. She saw Black Walder watching Robb's wolf, and wondered how long he would watch without wanting to test the edge of its teeth with his own. The crossing itself seemed to take a whole day. Robb rode first, with grey wind tight at his knee, and his wife beside him on a palfrey, the color of old pearls. The Freys lined the covered bridge to watch them pass, and to measure their new kin, as they would measure a cow at market. Roslin held the reins with the neatness of a girl brought up to do things properly, and Caitlin found herself falling in step at her flank, because she did not wish the child to feel the eyes alone. Men beat their fists on the walls as they went and hooted. Some tossed petals that had been dried and kept, and the petals caught in Roslin's hair and clung. The river sighed under them and tugged at the pilings, and Caitlin put out a hand to the wooden braces, once as if to steady herself against a boat's rocking. Lord Walder stood at the far end and counted them as they crossed, as if he meant to send a raven if the number on one side did not match the number on the other. The host rivered over the bridge until the fields beyond were littered with cook fires, and with pennons stuck in the damp ground like feathers. Tents went up with a sound like sails unfurling, canvas slapping, men swearing, women calling for water, horses snorting. The sky made up its mind and began to spit a fine needling rain that found every seam. Robb's captains gathered in a tent that smelled of wet leather and damp wool, and fear turned to resolve. Tywin Lannister sat at Harrenhal. They said Sir Stafford was raising a new host in the west. Stannis Baratheon had mustered at Dragonstone and sent letters full of iron. Renly had taken half the summer with him and turned it into banners. The Freys had 10, perhaps 11,000 men. Edmure held Riverrun against forays and fires, and the weary business of shooing wasps from a honeycomb without being stung. Winterfell waited. Everything waited. "We go to Riverrun to make the Trident whole," Robb said. His voice when he spoke to his captains was the voice of a boy who had learned to talk in a hall with men who put knives on the table when they sat down, and then had learned to make those knives lie flat. "After that, we prick the lion and make him bleed from a dozen little cuts. The west burns better than the bare ground of the Riverlands. Sir Brynden, you will ride ahead to my uncle with word of our passage and our new kin. The Frey levies will muster to Edmure and then to me. Lord Bolton! Lord Bolton!" "My king," Roose Bolton said, mild. "You will hold the green fork against any move by Tywin or by any man in his livery." Robb said, "You have the patience for it. It will be leeches and watchfires and listening. If he comes, you will tell me in time to come back with teeth. If he does not, you will keep my enemy thinking of you until he dreams of your eyes." "Men often do," Roose said. His hands were white and quiet on the map. The great John belched. "Aye, let the bastard of the Dreadfort's father teach lions to love leeches," he roared. "I will go where there is roasting. Send me west. I have not eaten a Lannister yet. Their fat is said to be sweet." "You will have your roast," Robb said, and the laughter eased the tension in the canvas as if someone had cut a guy line. When the council broke, the rain had turned the ground slick. Caitlin found Roslin at the flap with a maid and with one of the Frey boys. Perwyn, she thought, because he had an un-Frey-like kindness about the eyes. He bowed to her with an awkward flourish that kept him from looking her in the face. Roslin curtsied. "My lady," Roslin said, and her voice held up at the edges like a tray. "Your son has bid me ride with you to Riverrun. I was to ask, Is there a place where a harp would not be in the way? Behind her, the maid hid a smile. Caitlin felt hers come unaided. We will find a spot for it, she said. If it keeps our men from howling in the rain, it will be a treasure. Do you ride easily, child? Roslin looked down at her narrow wrists. Easily enough for a girl, she said, very honest. I have never ridden so far as River Run. I have never been out. Then we will show you the Riverlands, Caitlin said. And the sick, tight part of her that could not help but be a mother, even to a girl bred in another house, softened to think of the things that could be beautiful even in war. The willows on the banks, the places where the water went suddenly still and reflected a whole sky, the smell when rain stopped and dust rose. You will see how the trident runs when it is not bidding Freys and Starks to count one another like coins. Roslin's laugh came small and involuntary, and stopped with a hand to her mouth as if someone might scold her for taking sound without paying. My father counts everything, she said. So low that only Caitlin and the maid could hear. Let him, Caitlin murmured. We will count other things. They broke camp at dusk because the rain had decided not to cease, and moving men in wet daylight was as tireless as pushing a sledge uphill. Hooves made sucking sounds in the mud. The wolf rolled like smoke through their rear, and then vanished into the reeds. The Frey contingent was a scab of pale banners along their middle. Frey faces turned to watch Robb as if they were snakes, and he a particular flute. Lothar limped tirelessly from knot to knot, making sure that no Frey was placed where he did not wish him to be placed, and that all were placed where Robb might see and count and feel the weight of so many eyes. Caitlin kept her mare near the center with Roslin and Sirs Wendell and Purwin and the maid with the harp, who had wrapped it carefully in oilcloth and fussed with the ties every time they stopped to breathe a horse. The wind smelled of wet earth and something sweet from a hedge they passed. The sweetness did not last. The first night on the road, under a stand of poplars, Roslin breathed the dark as if it could be sipped. The girl sat on a low stool under the tent awning with the harp in her lap, and the rain drummed a soft accompaniment. Men came near with cups and with hands rough as bark and faces turned fascinated as boys. And when she began to play a ballad of the Mummers Ford, the noise of the camp folded itself in half to make room. Her fingers were deft and sure, and did not tremble when she played. Caitlin found Robb standing just beyond the circle of lamplight with his arms folded, listening, the rain making a fringe on his hair. His mouth was crooked with something like relief at the sound. Gray wind lay at his feet, like a shadow that had decided to be real. When the song wove itself to its end and let the quiet be quiet, one of the Karstark men wiped his eyes with the heel of his palm and swore, embarrassed, and the Gratchen declared it the best harp in the Riverlands, and threw a coin that bounced off the harp's neck and made Roslin flinch. Robb stepped forward and took the coin and gave it back to the Greatjon, and looked at him in a way that made that great man color. Caitlin saw the Frey faces watching this small exchange, the way crows watch a fox in a field. Later, when most had found their blankets, and what warmth there was to be had beneath them, Caitlin found the girl sitting with her hands spread to the brazier and her eyes fixed on the skin of her knuckles, as if they were maps she could learn by heart. Lots of daughters learn to count fires, Caitlin said, settling herself on the camp stool beside her. My father was good at making us watch and think. Roslin, are you content? The girl curved her shoulders a little and thought, the way a hair might flatten. I am a good girl, she said carefully. I will be a good wife. Then, after the small courage of a breath, he is less frightening than I thought a king would be. My son is not frightening, Caitlin said, and then smiled at herself and shook her head. To me, to men who have never yet met the far end of his sword, perhaps he is. Roslin glowed faintly in the firelight. He spoke to me as if I were a person. You are that, Caitlin said. You are a Frey, and now a Stark, and a woman in a camp full of men, with too many songs to drink and too many knives to polish. It will not be easy. But if he speaks to you as he spoke to me when he was small and broke a dish, and thought he had killed a lord by accident, you will hear the boy in him. When you hear that boy, tell him the man is doing as he should. Betty." The girl nodded, and then clasped her hands together as if to keep from speaking more. Caitlin wanted to put her arms around her, and did not. Roslin's life had been counted for her for so long that too much warmth might scald. They sat a while longer with the rain and the hiss of wet wood, and a scrap of song from a tent across the camp that kept forgetting its own verse. River Run rose out of the rain like memory. The red walls and the towers that had been her world filled the horizon one morning, when the clouds lifted and let blue show like a bruise healing. The river forked and forked again, and ran bright under the slant light. Men raised their voices, and horses lengthened their stride, smelling oats and stone. Caitlin swallowed the ache that rose like a tide in her throat. Her father's windows were open, and then closed, and then open again. River Run was a man's chest when he fought for breath with water in his lungs. Edmure rode out to meet them with a small honor guard and a face that had been pinched hard by duty. He was her little brother and a lord, and he wore both with the same slightly ill fit. His beard had picked up gray as if a painter had spattered him. He looked at Robb first, and then at Grey Wind, and then at the Frey banners, and then found Roslin at Caitlin's shoulder, and blinked. The Freys looked at him the way one hawk looks at another, calculating wingspan. "Sister," Edmure said, and leaned from his saddle and pressed his brow to hers, relief making him clumsy. "Kin. The Trident gives you welcome, and River Run gives you bread and salt, and a better bed than riverbank mud. And this, Menevsau, my lady wife," Robb said. He did not stumble over the word. It made a small warmth in Caitlin's chest. "Roslin of House Frey. My lady, this is Lord Edmure Tully, my uncle, who will pretend he commands me until I let him." Edmure made a face that would have been a boy's, if not for the men watching. "Lady Roslin," he said, and then added, lowering his voice with a conspirator's grin, "Walders? God save us!" "Edmure," Caitlin hissed. Roslin flushed and looked at her horse's mane with interest. "Your roof, uncle," Robb said, his tone mild. "And your bread and salt. And my walls, and my men, and my father, who does not want to die, if it's all the same." Edmure said, "Come in out of the weather, and we will make the lions wish they had never learned to swim." River Run's courtyard was as she dreamed it when the damp made her bones ache in some cold camp. A certain angle of light across the flagstones, the way the water hissed at the sluices, the smell of bread that at some hour of the day was always in the air if hosters' kitchens were doing as they should. Servants ran. Men shouted. The fish banners snapped and then guttered under a gust. Above, in a window that had been hers when she was a girl, she saw a ghost of herself run past and vanish. The world was a wheel that turned and never quite came to where it had been. Hoster lay like a wreck on a tide flat and rose and sank with breaths. His eyes filmed and unfilmed like a pond skin under wind. He knew her when she came because he said cat and lifted his hand, and then said tansy and wept without tears because he had none left. The maester put leaves to boil. Edmure stood at the foot of the bed and wrung his hands and tried not to be seen wringing them. Caitlin took her father's hand and listened to him speak to old women long dead, and spoke back the words he needed, and not the ones she needed to say. She told him of Robb and of the wedding and of the Frey's oath in simple terms that would not tangle. He nodded at the words as if they were a fair rate for barley. At the end he fell into sleep and snored the way he had always snored, as if he were hunting rabbits through hedges. Caitlin kissed his brow and came away with the salt taste of the life still in him. The days at River Run were a silence and a bustle at once. Robb heard reports and sent men. The Frey levies arrived in trains, pale as milk out of the rain, and billeted in the outbuildings with much counting and haggling over straw and grain. The lords of the Trident came in ones and twos to bend the knee and to eye their kings, new kin. Some had brought their wives, some their sons. Rickard Karstark came with a face like a storm and the names of his dead sons folded like knives in his breast. And he looked at Roslin once as if she were a tree with no fruit, and then looked past her forever. The Blackfish put the Freys where their counting would not trip any other man's feet, and went to look at the fords with the same satisfaction he had once taken from breaking a young horse to the bit. Roose Bolton, when he was not staring at flames, sat with a leech bowl and let the maester's boy draw blood from his pale arm, as if he were paying a tithe to a god. Only he knew. He was content to be the stone other men stubbed their toes on. Roslin learned the names of River-Run's corridors without seeming to. She had an instinct for moving where she was not most seen. In the great hall, she sat near Catelyn and the Blackfish, and listened more than she spoke. The Frey aunts hovered, measuring how much their girl was honored, whether her trencher held the better slices, whether the king asked her anything with the whole of his face turned to her, or only with a corner of his mouth. Sometimes in the afternoons, Catelyn found her in the small gallery with the harp, choosing notes like stitches. When a wind scudded up the river hard enough to ring the chimes by the east stair, Roslin stood in the arch and let the sound go through her. She would be homesick, Catelyn thought, for a house she had not loved. That was the way with women sometimes. What one missed was the shape of what had contained you. One evening, when the rain had exhausted itself and left the world smelling of stone, Robb came to the solar where Catelyn and Roslin sat with mending. Roslin could sew a seam true as a prayer, and he had Theon Greyjoy at his back, restless as a dog kept too long on a chain. Theon smiled at the women with all his teeth, because all his smiles were made of teeth. He bowed extravagantly to Roslin, and then ran a hand through his dark hair and looked at Robb as if to say, well then. I must speak plain, Robb said, which was something that always meant the words had been turning in his mouth so long they had smoothed themselves. He sat, and gray wind came to lie under his hand. The West will not be burned without flint. Tywin sits at Harrenhal and makes war on our bellies. We chew old grain and call it supper. Lord Manderley sends ships and asks for the lion's head to hang over his gate. But his ships must pass pike to come to me, and Balon Greyjoy keeps account of everything that floats near his rocks. We have sent ravens, and we have sent good words, and we have sent nothing the Iron King wants more than a chance to spit in someone else's soup. Nah. So spit first, Theon said, laughing. You know how to do this part, Robb. Give him a promise to chew. Let me go. I will sit at my father's knee and tell him he is a god. And then I will tell him gods get lonely and need friends who call them gods. He has long wanted to be made again into what he tells himself he was. Give him the chance to be the hammer on some Lannister anvil. The Ironborn will never love farming, but they will take plunder like fish take shining bait. Then chow. Catelyn's hands tightened on the linen without her wishing it. She held fast so as not to let the cloth slip. Theon, she said, and the name filled with old knights in Winterfell's hall when the boy had played with Bran's wooden soldiers and boasted twice as loudly when he lost. Your father rebelled. The cost fell first on others. Do you think he will set aside pride because you call it by a different name? Now. Theon's smile flattened. I think he will hear a son, he said, and for the first time his eyes were something other than merriment. The boy in him crept out from under the fox pelt. And I think he will hear that this son comes from a king with wolves and men at his back, and that the king's hand would pull the Iron Islands from the sea, and put them back again if they would help him take a lion's head. He will count that. He likes counting. Every man on the islands knows the number of the nails in his father's door, and Balon Greyjoy most of all. And no. Robb looked to his mother then, because he was wise, and because her face was where he had learned to look when there were two roads and neither was clean. In the corner of the room the candle flame made the map on the table look like a sea with moving currents. Catelyn thought of Ned and the way he had always chosen the hard right over the easy wrong, and paid for it with the fat of his heart. She thought of boys who were men because the gods had not given them time to be otherwise. She thought of ships with iron prow and men with oars, and of Winterfell's tall towers that had seen so much sky. I do not trust Balon Greyjoy, she said, because the thing one cannot say is the thing that rots the rest. I do not trust him to do anything but what will make men say his name to themselves at night and smile, because they can make their mouths do it. I do not trust a man who sets his own name first. But the sea is the sea, and we did not make Tywin Lannister build Harrenhal near it. If Balon swallows the bait and chokes on it, at least he will be full for an hour. Send a man you are willing to have disappointed and have back again still breathing. There are not so many of those. Damn. Theon's laugh sprang back up. I breathe like a bellows, he said. Let me go, and I will breathe fire in my father's ear. Robb tugged thoughtfully at the hilt of his sword. He had not yet learned to fidget, and this was the closest he came. You are my brother, he said. I would not send my brother if I did not think he could bring me what I ask. I do not send them away the way I send a raven. Go then. Tell Lord Balin Greyjoy that there is a king in the north whose friendship is worth more than every drowned man who ever thumped his chest. Tell him there is plunder to be had if he bears my banners. He glanced at Catelyn and amended. If he lets his men's ships bear my victories to me faster. Theon bowed as if he were in a mummer's play. I will speak in his language, he promised. I grew up in your godswood, but I have a salt voice still. He turned his grin on Roslin because it was in him to turn it on whatever light he could find. My lady, pray for me to drown with full lungs and be spat back up. Roslin's hands had gone still on the seam she was closing. She looked at him with the frank appraising gaze of a very young thing who had not yet learned that to look is to invite stories. I will pray the drowned god does not mistake your boasting for song, she said, as mild as milk, and then let the smallest smile show. Theon barked a laugh and made her a court bow that almost tipped him onto his nose. After he had gone, he always left a room like a boy rolling down a hill, faster at the last than anyone expected. Robb drew a breath so full it seemed to stretch his ribs. He looked at his wife then. It was not staged. There was no court in the solar. Only family and a map. Lady, he said, and the word was softer than his public ones. What do you think of sending a man to another man's father to beg for plunder? Roslin held her needle up to the candle to thread it, and did not pretend to be ready with a judgment. I think fathers love their sons in different ways. She said at last, with the care of a girl who had been hurt by a word for stepping on it wrong. I think a man who loves his son by making him hard will listen to him better when his son sounds like stone and not like water. I think your friend will go to his father and say, here is a stone you can throw. And will the old stone thrower throw it at my enemies or my house? Robb asked. Roslin blinked, and the candlelight blinked with her, shivering on the needle. I do not know, she said. My father taught me to count bread, not men. Catelyn could have kissed her for the honesty of it. Robb smiled that little sideways smile he had made with a gap-toothed mouth when he was 6, and had learned to twist cords without losing his temper. Counting bread is better work, he said. We would be better fed. Theon left at dawn 2 days later when the fog sat on the river like an old woman's shawl, and made the world quiet enough to hear midges whining. Robb walked him to the gate with Grey Wind, and with the Blackfish, and with more men than a purely ceremonial escort required. Because men's eyes were counting this too. Theon turned in his saddle at the last, and flashed that grin as if the world could not help but grin back. When I return, I will bring the sea with me, he said, and spurred. He took the south road and was swallowed by a cypress grove whose needles dripped last night's rain. For a moment, Catelyn stood with her hands folded and listened to the receding thud of hooves, as if they were someone knocking on a far door. Then she let her breath out, and felt the day settle on her shoulders, with the weight of all the other days that would come after it. Under the castle, the river went on saying the thing it always said. In the godswood, the old oak that stood in for a heart tree rattled its dead leaves and did not hear. Robb Stark, king in the north, went back to his maps and his men and his wife. Roslin Frey, daughter of the crossing, practiced a tune that she almost had in her fingers, and stopped when she realized it was a lullaby her mother had sung, and that she had not thought of in years. Roose Bolton bled himself into a bowl, and watched the dark red steam, that was not steam, and thought, as he always did, about what it was to be colder than other men. Edmure Tully rode the walls, and spoke to 5 men about straw, and 10 men about arrows, and 1 man about the way his knees ached. The Freys made their lists by candlelight, and lame Lothar's quill went scratching like a mouse under the hearth. The Greatjon, whose laughter frightened the dogs, slept like a stone with a girl on each arm and a wolf on his feet, until a dream dragged him upright, and he sat there blinking at the dark, before he lay down again and snored. Far away, on an island that had not cared about any man's maps in 1,000 years, a father turned his head because a raven hammered his shutter. Farther still, in King's Landing, a boy king broke a golden antler with his teeth to make a serving boy jump, and his mother took the shard and pretended to throw it in the fire and hid it in her sleeve. In a tent near Storm's End, a shadow waited for a candle to be put out. In Riverrun Solar, late, Catelyn sat alone for a little while, with the river's voice and the remembered voices of all the men of her house, and of one man whose voice she wanted like water. The heaviness in her sad bones was something she could not shake. She thought of the way Roslin had looked up at her son in the sept, of the way Robb had looked down and set the cloak on her shoulders with care. She had not wanted this marriage for her boy. The girl was a Frey, and nothing could unmake that. But the river did not stop for a name, and nor would this war. If there was kindness in it, it would come from the hands of men and women and not from the mouths of rivers or the ends of swords. She went down to the yard. The moon had torn itself free of the cloud like a birth. Men on watch stamped their feet and clapped their hands. A boy with the Karstarks, sunburst, yawned until his jaw cracked. On the parapet, she found Robb with Grey Wind's head in his lap, and Roslin a step away, her hands folded, looking out over the water as if counting the ripples. They had not heard her come. She stood and watched them a moment, the way a mother will watch when she can see the line where her child's life goes forward and hers cannot cross. Then she cleared her throat and let her heel ring once on the stone, and they turned. "Mother," Robb said. "My lady," Roslin said, and the small honesty of her bob of the head made Catelyn smile in the dark where they could not see it. "We must pray," Catelyn said, "for ships and for men, with sense enough to see when their boats are leaking, for bridges that hold, for sons who come back, and for daughters who find their feet under them." "But we will pray," Roslin said. Her voice was steady. Robb put his hand over the wolf's skull and stroked it with a rhythm that looked like thought. The river went on breathing, not caring, and the night was large as a tent over all of them. Somewhere, downriver, a fox cried like a child. The moon slid behind a cloud again and came out on the other side with its cheek rent as if by a claw. They stood there and watched, and the shape of what was to come crept along the walls, like a shadow that had yet to decide which man it meant to own. Okay. The long ships smelled of tar and salt rot and old fish, and the men aboard them smelled of the same but stronger, with the iron tang of blood that never truly left their clothes. Mist lay low on the sea, torn by prows and oars, and the heads of the waves wore little white crowns that were smashed to pieces under Victorian Greyjoy's iron hulls, as if men were born to break the sea. Theon stood at the prow of the sea bitch and tasted home in the spray, home and strangeness together, as if the drowned god had brewed a cup of salt water, and something sweet, and told him to drink it without closing his eyes. Aeron Damfair waited for him on the shingle, with his hair long as a weed and his beard roped into damp cords. He held a driftwood staff, and the gaze of a man who had seen his god blink. "You were taken from us," he said without greeting, "and shaped by trees. You smell of green. You must be drowned if you are to be made." Bah! Theon's smile was the one he always wore when annoyance and insult fell on him like rain. "I was never unmade," he said. "I am ironborn, uncle." "We are what we prove in water," Aeron said, and men in rough-spun and iron rings hauled him down to where the foam reached. He fought because it was in him to fight, and then he laughed because laughter was a kind of fight that did not cost your blood. They put him under, and salt went up his nose and down his throat and into his chest. And for a heartbeat, he thought he would come back as a fish, his limbs flukes, his eyes silver. They dragged him up again with his hair plastered and his ears roaring, and his heart hammering as if it would break itself against his ribs to be free. Aeron pressed his wet brow and called him reborn. "The drowned god keeps what is his," the priest said. And Theon spat and then wiped his mouth and grinned so his teeth showed white in the mist. "Hell keep me then," he said, "if I do not give him to someone else first." The sea tower rose out of the spray like a spine, slick with moss, windows filmed with blown salt. The rope bridge between the towers yawned and swung with the wind as if the sea were breathing with it. Theon crossed it with more bravado than surety, and told himself he did not grip the rope so hard that his knuckles paled. The guards at the door to the hall were gray with salt and indifference. Inside, Balin Greyjoy sat stiff as a spar in a chair made of torn sails and net. He had grown old inside his weather-beaten skin without letting it go slack. Theon went to one knee and then sprang up the way a boy does before anyone can tell him he has knelt too long. "Father," he said, and beneath the word lay all the things that were in it when a child hears it in the dark and knows it is protection, and all the things that are in it when a man says it to another man and knows it is a weight. "I come from the king in the north, Robb Stark, with oaths and offers to make us kin by victory." "Robb Stark," Balin Greyjoy said, tasting nothing in the name but green bitterness. "A green boy who puts dead wood on his head and calls it a crown. Has he sent you to ask me for oars? He sent you to ask me to be his dog." "He sent me to ask my father to be a king," Theon said, the reply whipped out like a blade. "To be the hammer that falls when he points. You want the world to say your name like a curse and a prayer? Help him break the lion's teeth. Break the reach ships that would sail to King's Landing. Break anything that moves where you do not want it. He pays with lion's gold and with Lannister throats." "Mendemtoai." Balin's lip curled. "You bring me a leash and call it a necklace," he said. "I will take no boy's hand. The north is ripe and ready to be cut. I will not mend another man's net. I will throw my own." "The north is Robb Stark's," Theon said, feeling the old heat rise. Boyhood and pride together, blood trying to make room for itself in his skin. "It is my brother's. It is mine, inasmuch as I broke bread in his hall and slept under his roof." "Then it is a sheepfold," Balin said, and the contempt in him old as reefs. "You grew up with shepherds and came back bleeding." Theon laughed because he had nothing else that would not break. "Then give me a wolf's job," he said. "Let me prove I am not what you think. Give me ships. Let me be the mouth that bites and not the one that calls for milk." Asha came in then, with storms in her hair, and the grin of a girl who was never wrong about who she was. "Baby brother," she said, and kissed him as if to see if he were made of salt or of clay. She had a man's ease in the hall, and a woman's knowledge of how to make every man in it look without thinking about it. "He's grown," she said to their father. "He's grown some foolishness and some courage. They have salted him at least." Balin rapped his knuckles on the arm of the chair. "You will have the sea, bitch," he told Theon, without looking to see if the gift made his son's face light like a boy's at Yule. "Dagmar Cleftjaw will go with you to the stony shore to teach you to count the burnings when the wind blows off the land. Asha takes Deepwood Mott. The drowned men go up the neck, while the wolf runs about his brown country looking for lions. We will lock the door of the north. We will be kings of the rocks we can stand on." Theon felt the words blow through him like a wind too cold to breathe. He bowed low, because it could be made to look like a victory, and because it was all the victory there was to be had in a hall where his father had already set his course and thrown the rope to the drowned god for luck. Later, when the lamp smoked and his hands stank of the broth he had eaten, Asha found him by a window with the sea touching blackness beyond and leaned her shoulder to his as if they had never been children who had fought over a toy. "You wanted to go back to your trees," she said. "You came to ask our father to love a boy he never met." He made his mouth twist into a grin. "I came to ask him to be someone other than Balin Greyjoy," he said. "It was a jest from the start. Jests are for men who can pay for them when they fail," Asha said, amused. "Can you pay? Can you keep your breath underwater?" She took his chin in 2 fingers and looked into his eyes, as if to see if something floated there. "We are what we can take. Take what you can, Theon. If you say words about brothers, make them into something that floats, or it will be you that drowns." He slept on the sea bitch with tar and salt around him, and too many thoughts in the tight space of his skull. In the morning he laughed too loudly when he called for oars, and his men answered him because there was food and spoils at the end of the oar stroke, and because he stood like a man who could make spoils happen. Dagmar Cleftjaw sat silent and watched and chewed at a bit of bone until it frayed, and then showed him on the shore how to leave a small wound that would bleed long. They burned a fishing village that stank of herring and smoke and fear. Theon gave a child a coin and told himself that made something better. They pulled down a little timber palisade with ropes and hands and threw it into the sea, and called that a castle taken. Theon grinned into the wind and tried to make the grin be iron. He made stories around what he could not change and told them to himself in his head until they had weight. When Dagmar said, in his soft, cracked voice, that there was a way to make those stories matter, Theon leaned close to listen. "We will raid the stony shore," Dagmar said, "and make them call for their mothers. The old knight at Winterfell will have to go and tell them to stop crying. When he goes, you will make yourself a lord with a key. Then, and if the key does not turn," Theon said, smiling too much to keep the men from seeing the way his belly went hot and cold. "Then you will be what the god made us to be," Dagmar said, patience like an old nail in him. "You will drown, but you will have tried to eat with both hands." The stony shore burned neatly. Smoke rose in lines, and the wind took it and smeared it out. And from the high land, the sun made it look like ghosts leaving the earth. Theon stood above a little crofter's place and watched a dozen of Robb's banners fade across the distance as men rode hard to answer all of the noise in the wrong place. Then he turned his horse's head toward the wolf's empty hall. Winterfell slept in the rain the night he came, with the 2 wooden wolves on its gate wet-eyed and slick. There were fewer guards than any hall ought to boast even in peace, and their boots were full of water and weariness both. Theon rode to the gate like a man with business. When he was close enough for his voice to carry, he called, "Open, Thine. Sir Roderick returns. The raiders have been driven into the hills." The lie came easy. Lies had always come easy. He showed teeth like a friend, and sat his saddle like a man who had never fallen. The gate opened with a clatter of chains and wet ropes, and he put his heels to his horse, and was inside before anyone thought that a friend's smile could show too much tooth. It happened quickly because quick was all that would do. A woman screamed, because what else can you do when you realize you have let a fox into your coop, and it has teeth in every part of its mouth? Theon took the yard with 10 men and a voice that could fill a hall with confidence and fear together. When he stood in the great hall under Bran Stark's seat, oh gods, under Eddard Stark's chair, sitting as if the wood had been made for him, he wanted to vomit up all the names in him. He grinned instead and called for wine and sent a boy to fetch Maester Luwin. The maester came with his chain ringing softly, and his face like a book with too many pages bent backward. Theon told him what he meant to be. It sounded well in his own ears, and lied less to itself the more he said it. "I am Theon of House Greyjoy," he declared, "and Winterfell is taken for my father, Balon, who is king of Salt and Rock and of the North besides. I am the prince here. Swear to me and live as you have lived, with wolves turned to krakens. Resist and I will show you that iron rusts less than men think." Maester Luwin looked at him with the patience of a man who has dealt with boys for too long, not to see where the boy shows in them. "Theon," he said, not giving him prince, not giving him lord. "You were raised here, and there was bread in the hall for you. The people you threaten fed you at their own tables. Do what you must as a man who wears iron, but do not pretend you are not what you were as a child." "Ben Tramosan. What I was as a child was a hostage," Theon said, stung, the word picked out of him like a burr. "Now I am a prince. Princes make things," Maester Luwin said, soft and implacable. "They do not only take them." Theon made something then. He made fear. He made a speech to Farlan and Mikken, and the rest that promised their lives and their livelihoods if they bent and kissed a kraken instead of a wolf. He made the winter town come and look at him, and he made their eyes go away from him when he called for pledges, because he could not bear them all at once. He made the word murder into something else. He made men drag 2 charred boys to hang from the gates where ravens could find them in the morning. That night, when he lay in Eddard Stark's bed, he put his face in the pillow to hide the noise he made from whatever gods might be listening. At River Run, the morning after, a raven from White Harbor brought word that Renly Baratheon had been stabbed to death by shadows or by treachery or by a wife or by a god. Catelyn went to the parapet and looked east. The sky was bright and hard, and the water slid narrow and quick below the walls. Roslin came beside her without announcing herself, as she often did, and leaned both hands on the stone as if to borrow steadiness. The girl's face had lost some of its transparency in the weeks at River Run, eating with women who had children and men who had swords had given it a little color. She had learned to take the best cut on her trencher without looking around for someone to scold her, and to ask for hot water without apologizing. Her hair was braided like a river woman's now, and she had put on a cloak that had no Frey blue in it at all. Wool the color of wet stone clasped with a fish, as if being Queen of the North means finding the colors of whatever ground you stand on. "Your face is very still," Roslin said. "That is when you are thinking." "It is when I am trying not to," Caitlin said, smiling because it might give the girl something to lean on. Renly was young and quick and full of laughter. I met him once when he was 13 and still had sweetness. He told a joke about a hound and a peacock, and laughed so hard he dropped his pear. "That little boy dies every time a man like him dies later. I do not like it. I do not like it. I do not like the taste it leaves in me." "People laugh less here," Roslin said, looking along the wall to where the Great John was telling a story with his hands big as flatfish, and making two Karstark men grin despite themselves. "And when they do, it is for knives. Almost always. Knives are honest," Caitlin said. "They do not change what they are. It is their use that changes men." "Does your son laugh?" Roslin asked, and then colored. "He does. I have heard it." "I only meant, does he laugh when no one is watching, and not only when it is useful?" Caitlin thought of Robb playing at drafts with Bran, cheating by accident and admitting it with a face so open it made Lys look ashamed. She thought of his grin when the stable cat had stolen a whole fish from beneath a cook's nose, and he had chased it halfway across the yard to rescue it. She thought of his laughter with the Great John, and how it soothed large men, and made them feel they had contributed to the world's fortunes. "He does," she said. "He will again. This is a bad season for laughing, but seasons turn." That afternoon the ravens came like a swarm, gray birds and black words. Deepwood Motte had fallen to Asha Greyjoy. The stony western shore was aflame. Moat Cailin's throat was being choked by iron. And Winterfell, was taken by Theon Greyjoy, boy who had chased Bran with wooden swords, boy who had sat at Ned's board and stolen apples with Arya when the servants weren't looking, boy who had wept once when a hawk they had tried to train would not come to his glove. The word put a hole through the day. It was clean and circular and rang on the edge when you touched it. It put a hole through Catelyn's heart and made a sound like bone when it went in. She did not remember walking from the hall to the solar. She remembered Roslin's hand on her arm and the way it lightened when she pulled away because she could not bear a kindness at that moment. A kindness was another hole, and she did not know how many a woman could have and still stand. Edmure came, his beard bristling with the way his skin rose when it wanted to fight, and make that be the thing that solved everything. "We will ride," he said. "I will send 500 down the King's Road now. The Dreadfort owes you old debts. The Umbers will come down from Last Hearth. We will make a river of wolves. We will unmake a kraken. Many. Send them into a bog," the Blackfish said, cold. "Moat Cailin is a choked throat. The north is sealed. You will send good men to die in a ditch. We have a neck made of water and mud. You must use it as a neck is used, to turn ahead, not to ram it against stones." The cry that had been in Caitlin since she was a girl, and had buried a doll in the kitchen garden like a child, because she wanted to know what it felt like to be the one left behind, came then. It did not come out of her mouth. It went through her like a wire pulled taut until it sang. She sat and folded her hands and told herself to count. Fingers, bones, breaths. It was an old trick, and it saved you when you forgot how to be saved. When she could speak, she said, "There were 2 boys hung from the gate. Bran and Rickon," Edmure whispered. Horror and denial wrestling in him, and neither managing to pin the other. "They said so," Caitlin said. Words are easy. She believed because she could not afford to believe anything until she had touched the dead and kissed their heads. Hope and denial were twins. You could not tell them apart until one of them grew old. That night she went to the cell where Jaime Lannister was kept with chains around wrists and ankles, and a light that burned steady and hateful in a bracket. Brienne stood with her, blue eyes good as iron, big hands easy at her sides. The Kingslayer smiled with half his mouth, the way men do when they do not wish to let anyone know their teeth are broken. "My lady," he said, with the lightness he had found at some point inside himself when heaviness would have crushed him. "Have you come to admire my ornaments?" Caitlin thought of Sansa and Arya like cups left in a rainstorm, and of two charred boys left, as if to feed ravens, and of a man with golden hair who had shoved a boy out a window. She thought for a long time before she spoke, because she did not wish to put any more lies into the air around her than the day had already made. When she did, her voice was level. "I am a mother," she said. "If I can buy a step toward my daughters with iron, I will do it. If I can buy it with shame, I will do it. I cannot buy it with my sons' lives any longer, not if I sit and let them be used as bargaining chips for other men's prides. I am going to send you to your sister and your son to beg for a trade. You will swear by everything you have ever sworn by that you will do what I ask, or you will offer your head to whatever God will have it." "Berine." Brienne's breath hitched as if to object, and then stopped, because she had learned that this woman was a force and not a petition. Jaime's smile drained. "And if I give you my head now," he said, "will it be of any use? If I thought it would build a bridge, I would lay it down for you?" Caitlin said. "It will build me nothing. It is a stone that will sink in a pond and leave a circle that will be gone by morning." "I do not like to drown," Jaime said very softly, and for the first time since she had seen him in chains, he looked the age he was and not the age he pretended. "I will swear." He swore, and perhaps he meant it, and perhaps meaning was the same as doing for a man who had had everything stripped but his name and what he told himself about it. Brienne took him in the dark, and nobody saw them go, but two silent men and the ghosts that live in keeps and roll their eyes at men's foolishness. Roslin found Caitlin in the hours before dawn. When the candles had burned down so far the pools around the wicks were small and trembled. The girl came with a cup of broth and put it down as if she were laying a baby in a cradle. "Quiet, careful. You should eat," she said, "because people say that when they do not know what else will keep another person from breaking." Caitlin looked up and wanted to say something that would make this younger woman's face not look like a window in winter. "Gee-way." A dozen sentences rose and froze and fell. "You are kind," she said, a small truth. Then, because she had always been too honest with the people she loved, even when it would be kinder to lie, "If Robb had not married you, Lord Frey would have killed him." Roslin blinked. Her throat moved. He would have counted what was owed. She said, after a moment in which she might have reached to steady herself, and decided not to. "He always counts. He counts and he keeps tally," Catelyn said. "He has a tally of wrongs he likes to leaf through at midnight. But there is this as well. He is a father. Kings and lords and traitors are all fathers sometimes. He has not made up his mind which tally to use yet. We must not help him choose the wrong one." Roslin put her hand out, just halfway, and did not touch Caitlyn's arm. "I will count with you," she said. In the days that followed, the Riverlands breathed shallow. Tywin Lannister tested the fords and found Edmure waiting with spears, and a plan that had been argued until the arguing wore smooth, and then polished to a shine by the Blackfish's persistent whetstone voice. Men in red and gold threw themselves against water turned weapon, and felt the river take their feet and their breath, and then saw spears come at the edge of their vision, and had to choose between drowning and dying with mud in their mouths. Edmure, who was always too conscious of how he looked in his armor, and of what men thought of him inside his own hall, found himself doing a thing so simple that even he could not foul it. Hold here, reap there. Fall back by yards and not by rods. Make the enemy pay for each step with a limb. He shone with the sweat of it at the end of each day, and said to anyone who would listen that his father would have been proud. Men told him yes, because sometimes it is good to let men think they have done what they have done, without telling them they have done it only because someone else would not stop beating their plan into their heads. Messages tacked themselves onto other messages, until a man could be killed by a sheaf of them if it fell from a table. Renly dead. Stannis gathered. Tyrell sniffing for the winds of bread. Tywin held, then turned, then vanished like a fox on the trail to King's Landing. Edmure's victory had been steady and good, and exactly the wrong thing in the long flow of things. Robb had wanted the lion drawn west to be hamstrung, and instead the lion had been turned east and made to run faster. They sat over a map and traced the movement with a finger, and found that fingers could not make it go any other way. Roose Bolton came and went, like a ship that does not wish to make land. Light on the water, never quite in the place he said he would be, always managing to arrive with enough blood on his hands to prove he had been somewhere. He took Harrenhal when Tywin moved and stood in its black belly like a man who likes damp stone and the way smoke lingers under high ceilings. He sent men to die to Vargo Hoat's music and called that justice. When he came to River Run again to sit in council and leach his pale blood into a bowl in the maester's turret, he offered no counsel that was not a mirror. "If you move, you will be seen," he told Robb. Almost mild. "If you stay, your enemy moves. It is the nature of water and of war. Do you wish to be a river or a fish?" "A wolf," Robb said with a smile as thin as the lines on the map. "One that swims." Then the other raven came, the one with words that tasted of ash. Winterfell burned. The castle that had watched more sky than any other since the first men had learned to fix stone to stone, sent up a pillar into the night like a message written to gods who did not read. Bran and Rickon, no sure word. The Charred boys had not been Stark boys. Maester Luwin dead in the Godswood with a spear for company. Sir Roderick cut down before the gates. Ironborn gone like a tide. And Theon Greyjoy taken, alive, and carried off by Ramsay Snow, the bastard of Bolton, back to the Dreadfort wrapped in wet leather like meat left for a dog. A quiet fell in the hall then? A quiet so complete that even the torches did not crackle. Catelyn held a letter that had arrived tied to the raven's leg and felt its creases. The hand that had written it had pressed hard, as if to make the words bite the page. It was one of Roose's men's hands, neat and stiff. It made a story look simple. The story was never simple. "My king," Roslin said, from her place slightly behind Robb's shoulder, where she had learned to stand with the quiet of someone who will not be dismissed, but will never draw a sword for attention. "The Dreadfort is yours by right. The man in it is yours by courtesy. The boy he has taken is yours by old bread and salt. He will not eat him if he thinks you are watching." Robb's mouth tightened until the line of it could have been a blade. "He will eat him if it pleases him," he said, and there was a weariness in the bluntness that made Catelyn's heart twist. "Roose? My bastard is a useful dog," Roose said, with the softness that always made men lean closer, as if they had not heard. "He bites. He frightens rats into the open. He does not always understand where to stop pulling flesh from bone. If you wish him leashed, I will leash him. If you wish him fed, I will feed him. But sometimes, a dog that has tasted man meat will not eat oatcakes again." Edmure made a sound of disgust, and the Greyjoy swore. Roslin's hands folded more tightly until the knuckles showed bone. The Blackfish watched Roose the way a man watches a pool for eels, knowing something will flicker, not yet knowing the shape of it. "We will leash him," Robb said. "We will make a show of leashing him. We will not see the boy killed because a man wants to frighten crows from his walls. Send word with my seal. Theon Greyjoy is taken at my command and will be delivered to me. I will judge him. No man will take that right from me. And send word to the north, the Umbers, the Manderleys, the men of the Hornwood, the mountain clans. Hold. Do not throw yourself at stone for pride. We will come. We will open the neck." "Damn." The letter went, and Roose's face did not change. Perhaps it could not. Perhaps it was a face carved from something that did not respond to heat or cold, except in the way it narrowed. 2 days later, when the morning dark had not yet lifted its lid and the torches guttered like sick hearts, the prison guards shouted, and then shouted again like men trying to drown out the sound of what they had done. They had always been too few for a king's hall. They had looked away too often. Rickard Karstark's men had gone where they wished, because grief is a sword and a key together, and a man in the grip of it kicks down doors. The Lannister squires, Willem Lannister and Tion Frey. Boys with hair they had not yet learned to comb properly, and faces that still went blotchy when they ran, lay with their throats cut and their eyes open to the ceiling. Blood had run to the cracks of the stones and dried there like mortar. It took the rest of the morning to convince anyone to speak, and another to untangle what was true from what men wanted to be true to shade their own part. In the end, truth lay there, unadorned. Rickard Karstark had gone to buy vengeance, and he had paid for it by stealing boys' lives. He stood before Robb with a face as ruined as any man's Catelyn had seen on a battlefield. His beard thick and unkempt, his hands empty, as if he had forgotten he owned them. "You have killed the son of a man who is under my protection," Robb said, his voice level, iron. "You have killed the son of a man who has done me no personal harm, and who is of a house that has bent the knee to me. You have killed a boy who might have been ransomed. You have killed Tion Frey, whose blood is now my wife's blood in 1,000 small ways. You have made war on your own kin's peace." "I have killed lions," Rickard Karstark said, and the deadness in his voice was a sound Catelyn knew. The voice of a man who has broken something in himself and is waiting to be told whether there is anything left to do. "I would kill them all. I would kill you if you were one and wore your father's face. My sons are dead. And see. And mine," Catelyn said aloud before she knew she would, and then bit her lip and tasted iron. "And mine are dead, if we count boys before we have seen their bodies with our own eyes. We do not kill children to make old griefs lie down." Rickard Karstark looked at her without seeing her. "I have done what any father would do who remembered his sons, more than he remembered a king," he said. "And I will do what a king must do who remembers his laws more than your grief," Robb said. He rose. No boy stood there now. He had a man's gravity and a man's sentence in his mouth. "You will die for this." The hall stirred like a thing waking, because it had never thought to see such a day, not in 1,000 mornings. The phrase hissed like a nest poked with a stick. Lame Lothar leaned to say something to Black Walder, and Black Walder's head jerked as if someone had pulled a cord. Roslin closed her eyes and opened them again, and stood very straight. Edmure looked at Catelyn with his mouth open in a half-formed word that could have been Daunt, or could have been Gods. The Great John shrugged his great shoulders and looked down at his big hands, as if to see if blood had appeared there of its own accord. Rickard Karstark died before midday, taking the blessing of no god from any hand. Robb swung the sword himself. He did it because he had learned from a man who had taught him with his own hand that a lord who would take a man's life must look in his eyes when he took it. The blade did not need to be swung twice. The Karstark men rode away at dusk with their banners folded and their faces like frozen rivers. Outside the walls, the rain began again, very softly, as if the day were tired of hardness and wanted to undo something of what it had made. Catelyn went to the God's Wood and knelt where there was no heart tree, only an old oak that bore scars from older storms, and thought of Ned, and of Bran and Rickon, and of the weight of a sword in her son's hands, and of the lightness that comes after, when a man leans and his breath leaves him as if it had been holding itself in all day. She pressed her forehead to the damp bark and let it wet her hair, and listened to the river through the wall. It could not pray for her. It could not do anything but go on, and sometimes that is what is needed. Hoster Tully died when the weather turned warm enough to make men think harvest might come after all the burning. He called for Tansy with his last breath, and for Catelyn with the one before it, and then his hand sank, and the room emptied of something that had taken up more space than anyone had thought it did. Edmure's sobs shook his shoulders like a boy's. The Blackfish stood like a knot of iron, and did not weep because something in him was made of a piece that did not know how. But afterward, when he came to find Catelyn alone in the little chamber where Hoster had kept his best wine, he leaned his forehead against the door and closed his eyes for a long count. They dressed Hoster in river blue and white and coins on his eyes. Edmure sent for his bow and fumbled the string twice, and the men behind him did not quite hide their coughs. The barge slid from the ramp like a thought slipping from a man's mind. Edmure set his feet and drew and loosed and missed, and the barge drifted and the torch in it guttered and almost went out. For a breath too long, everything hung in that small, humiliating place where love and failure meet. Then a second shaft hissed out of the line of men. Sraida's truth, and kissed the pitch and gave it life. Fire ran up the little vessel's sides with greedy hands. Edmure choked and made a sound that would have been a thank you if it had had less salt in it. The current took the barge. For a long time they watched until it was only a flicker, and then a heat, and then a memory. Roslin stood a step behind Caitlin with her hands tight in her sleeves and her head bowed. When the barge turned a far bend, she moved close enough that her shoulder brushed Caitlin's cloak. It was small. The contact. Like the touch of a sparrow's wing. It held. News of King's Landing's salvation came up the river like dead fish. Belly up, white eyes. Stannis broken on the Blackwater by wildfire. By a chain. By a father come with a new brood of sons-in-law. By a city that had scraped its bottom for knives and found enough to cut. Tywin and Mace Tyrell paraded like merchants who had bought everything and meant to raise prices. Sansa and Arya. Still in the city. Still beyond reach. The list of things Caitlin could not do for her children multiplied in her mind like gnats. On a night when the torches in the hall had gone out early, because the tallow was bad and dripped, Robb came to find Caitlin and Roslin in the solar. He had a look she had not seen on him since he had been small, and could not decide whether to turn his pony to the left or right around a puddle because he wanted both and neither. He stood in the door and did not come in for a heartbeat that told her he was measuring what he meant to say. Grey Wind came to her and put his head under her hand and leaned, heavy and solid. And she thought, God, let me be stone for this and not water. Mother, Robb said. Wife. Roslin rose and bowed her head and sat again when Caitlin motioned. There was a quiet in the room that had nothing to do with the hour. He came forward and knelt by Caitlin's chair the way he had done when he was 10, and had broken a cup he loved, and had needed to say he was sorry to the cup, and to himself more than to anyone else. He took her hand and put it to his cheek and held it there. I have undone part of what I am, he said. I have killed a man for justice and lost his men for pride. I have sent my sworn prisoner away for love. I have lost the North for trusting a boy who called me brother. I have married a Frey girl and saved our men from a river. He looked up at her then, the eyes of Eddard Stark looking out of a face that was his own. I cannot tell which of these things I should have done and which I should not. I do not know where to put my feet next. Caitlin had wanted always to be able to tell her children where to put their feet. The world is a series of stones in a river, and a mother wants to stand on the bank and show which ones will hold. The river shifted, and the stones sank and rose without asking her. She put her hand to his hair because it was something she could still do. You will put your feet where there is ground, she said. There will be ground because you will make it, and because there are men who love you enough to put their backs under your feet when you step. You will be wrong. You will be right. You will go on. There is no other thing to do. Roslin's hands had tightened on the mending she did not need to be doing. She cleared her throat. My lord, she said, and did not call him king in that room because there was no need to be ceremony there. Lord Walder writes, he has named the sons and nephews he would be pleased to see honored, and the lands he thinks suitable for them. He has asked whether I have quickened. Betty. Caitlin's mouth quirked despite the weight of the hour. Do you always say the ugly thing so that it does not grow prettier by being left unsaid? She asked softly. Roslin's eyes widened, and then she smiled, small and tired. If I leave a thing alone, it grows teeth, she said. Robb laughed, once, without much mirth. Tell Lord Walder that his grandsons are honored whenever they do not pick their teeth with their knives at my table, he said. Tell him we will speak of lands when there is land to give. Tell him my honor stands and his bridge holds. Tell him what you like, wife, so long as it does not make him count the knives he has sold me and find them fewer than the ones he thinks he is owed. Roslin nodded. I will write, she said. If he wants a list, I can make him one. In the Dreadfort, the wind curled under the eaves and brought a smell that was not quite the smell of meat, and not quite the smell of a tannery. Theon Greyjoy hung in his mind before he hung in his body. Pain remade him. It was ugly work, and it happened mostly in the dark, and the man who did it smiled seldom and sang. Never, and liked to cut the laugh from a man's throat and keep it in a jar. Theon learned the language of the flaying knife. He learned its res and its ls, the way it tried to convince you there had been no other language before it. He learned to call himself by other names, and to know that names were a kind of weather. He learned that a man who had wanted to make himself into a lord by a quick cut could be mated into meat by slower ones. He learned the taste of betrayal from both sides and found that the taste did not change depending on where you sat. He learned finally that he still loved a boy who had called him brother, and that love is a flensing, clean, and merciless. He dreamed sometimes of a girl laughing as she splashed him with river water, and of the way sun and shadow had made a checkerboard of the stones in the Winterfell yard. And when he woke there was leather in his mouth, and he could not tell whether his lips had been bleeding, or he had bitten himself, because it was the only thing a man could do of his own volition in a place where volition had been stripped like bark. Ravens crossed the sky every day as if the air had become a road for messengers. Some went to the twins and did not return. Some went to White Harbor and came back with words about ships and bread, and the kind of hope that men build when they stack flour sacks against a siege. Some went to the Neck and came back caked with mud, and carrying small notes about frogs and spears. Some went to Pike and were eaten on the way by the wind. One, with a band of Bolton red around its leg, came to River Run and said in a dry little voice that Roose Bolton had taken the bastard of his house in hand and would bring him to heel, and that Theon Greyjoy was well guarded and would be delivered in chains as the king commanded when the roads ran free of lions. Edmure said something about trusting a fox to keep hens, and laughed, and then stopped when no one else did. The Blackfish lifted an eyebrow. Roslin's needle paused, and Catelyn thought, "Careful, girl. Do not let the men see your face when they speak of dogs." She looked instead at her son, and he did not look at anyone at all, as if he could keep the world in place for a moment longer, if he did not blink. In the west, the lion licked wounds and sharpened claws. In the Reach, flowers opened their petals wide under a hot, vicious sun and drank. In the north, men hunkered and ate their last onion and looked out over fields that had been green and then gray and now brown and thought about where bread comes from. In the Vale, Lysa Arryn combed her son's hair and told him that birds are kinder than boys and boys kinder than men. In the Stormlands, a wind with no city to hit blew itself out and died. At River Run the fish banners hung damp and heavy. A harp plucked in a room where two women sat and mended and spoke little. The king in the north came to his maps each morning like a man going to sea, and hoped to come back each night without having drowned. The Freys counted. The Freys always counted. But when Roslin Frey paused in her playing because her fingers ached and looked up at her husband and measured him, she did not count like her father did. She counted in another way, measuring not how much she might gain, but how much a man could be asked to carry before his back bent. The river breathed. The nights lengthened. Somewhere in a dark cell, a woman with a sword led a man through a dream of dangers toward a city where a mother's weary hope waited. And somewhere in a colder, darker place, a man with no name learned that there are worse things you can be called than traitor. All of it moved, slow as frost. Robb stood once on River Run's outer wall at dawn, with only gray wind for company, and looked north until his eyes stung. He thought of Winterfell's towers like fingers, and of a boy chasing a cat under a long table, and of a girl who had learned to tell the truth, even when it was the thing that hurt her most. He thought of a woman far away who might be brave enough to do for him what he did not know how to ask. He thought of men he had killed, and men he would have to kill, and men he would never be able to save. He thought of a Frey girl's small hand on his sleeve, a moment when he had wanted to break something, and how he had not. Behind him, a stair creaked. He did not turn because he knew the sound now, and could have named it among 100. His wife moving her weight carefully because the stone was always damp there, and could take a foot out from under you. He said without looking, "If you tell me to come in from the cold, I will say I am not cold." "I will say nothing," Roslin said. She came to stand beside him and set her hand flat on the merlin. "I only wanted to see what you were looking at." "The same thing I always am," he said. "Everything." They stood there together until the light strengthened enough that the river changed color and showed the fish under the surface turning. It would not be enough light, not for a long time, not for what they had to do. But it was the light they had, and they took it into themselves as if it had been meat and bread. No bells rang. No ravens came. For those moments the world did not ask anything of them, except that they stand, breathing, and look. Ka. They came upon them where the road folded between two low hills tufted with scrub and bramble, where the sun had heated the stones until they held the day in them even after the light had gone. The horses snorted at the smell of men who did not wash in steel that had been wiped, not cleaned. Brienne raised her hand, and Jaime's gelding pricked its ears, as if it too had learned to pay heed when the woman in blue lifted a finger. It did not matter. The men were already there, all patchwork and leer, their rags made colorful through accident, their teeth through neglect. One wore a scarf braided with tiny bells. When he moved, they chimed softly like insects humming in a nest. "Mercy," said their captain in a voice like butter left too long by the fire. Sweet mercy for poor companions. He rolled the S in companions until it became something else. "Vargo Hoat, at your service." "You serve the goat," Jaime said, smiling for the first time in days, because at last something in the world had the shape of a joke he recognized. "And your goat served the Lannisters." "How goes your loyalty when your bell rope changes hands?" Brienne's blade hissed free. She did not waste words. Her sword was a vocabulary of its own, and had long since learned its grammar. There were too many of them. She cut one man out of his saddle with a neatness that would have made any knight squire proud, and dragged Jaime's horse back by the bridle with her left hand while she parried with her right. When the third came at her from behind, bells chiming, she turned on the ball of her foot and put her fist into his face so that he reeled backward, bleeding laughter. By then they were all around them like weeds. Jaime took a man's knife from his belt by stepping on his hand and bending until the chain around his wrists bit. And then he grinned and let himself remember for a heartbeat who he had been. The best sword in the 7 kingdoms, and a blade that had never yet been thwarted except by a boy's window. He put the knife into the bellman's thigh and felt a wash of satisfaction, almost like relief. "Enough," Vargo Hoat said, as if he were telling hounds they had rolled too long in something sweet. "You come to Harrenhal. The lord there likes music. We will sing to him. Pity for the pretty pig if she does not sing." "Now." They bound Brienne while 3 men bled. They bound Jaime, who laughed too hard because laughter was sometimes the only clean thing left in a day. When they walked them to Harrenhal between pikes, the sunset had gone smoky, and the castle rose like a broken tooth stained by all the dinners it had ever eaten. In the yard, a man with quiet eyes in a plain cloak watched Vargo Hota's ribbons wag and said nothing until they were done. He looked at Brienne as one might look at an interesting tool, and at Jaime as if he were an old charge unpaid. "My house thanks you for the gift," he said at last, and his voice was a winter stream over stones. "Put them in the tower cells and find a leech for my arm." "Lord Bolton," Brienne said, because there were forms even when there were none. Her wrists were torn at the bone from the chain already, and yet her voice did not drag. "I am charged by Lady Catelyn Tully to bring Sir Jaime Lannister to King's Landing to exchange for her daughters. By the honor of your house and the old laws of guest right. Guest right is bread and salt." Roose Bolton said, "Cool. You have had neither here. You have had misfortune, which is a dish men eat without salt and seldom by choice. The brave companions serve me. They are good dogs when one has a need for rats to be worried. I do not have a need for them today." He turned away. Vargo Hoat's bells chimed again as he bowed and slouched after him like a shadow trying to remember its shape. Jaime Lannister spent a night chained to a ring set into Harrenhal's damp wall, and when he woke the next morning, it was to a pain that seemed almost uninteresting because it had no texture, only heat. His right hand, unbandaged, black and clumsy. Vargo Hoat had taken it in the night with a butcher's ease, and had laughed because he did not like pretty things that did not belong to him. When Brienne saw it, she turned her head away and then back again, and her face set like metal cooling. "Breathe," she said. "I have never had trouble with the intake of air," he said, and then he did have trouble with it, and after a while, he stopped speaking because his mouth tasted of tin. Later he stared at the stump and felt something stranger than nausea come up in him. The knowledge that a thing he had been was gone and would not come back. and that what would be left would have to be learned from the beginning like letters. He practiced opening and closing the hand that was not there because he could no longer stop himself from trying. Qyburn came with his quiet smile and his gentle, appalling hands. "It will suppurate less if I cut away this bit," he said. And then, when Jamie's breath hissed between his teeth, "I was once a maester. We were not always made to be crude. Sometimes I remember to tell my fingers as much. And now, tell your fingers to keep me alive," Jamie said. "I have a sister to tell this joke to, and it will not mend by the time I reach King's Landing. But it will at least be mine." Brienne was not put in the same cell. The ring in her wall was set higher because her arms were longer. Sometimes at night she sang under her breath in a voice that did not know how to be beautiful, but knew how to be true. He slept in the pauses between her notes. In the yard she fought a bear because men wanted to see a woman die, and because Vargo Holt had a love for theater. And when Jamie heard the uproar and the snarl, and the particular men's laughter that happens only just before something awful, he went down into the yard without a word and discovered that he had learned something overnight. That his body would begin to run to save a woman who had refused to abandon him, even when it had given her a dozen reasons. He took the bear's attention with his voice, which had always been good at drawing eyes, and with the sudden shine of steel in another man's wobbling hand, and with the certainty that men like Vargo were bound by habit to spectacle, and could not look away when it turned. He bought a moment with that certainty and with a lie, and Brienne, who understood when a moment had been purchased, climbed the rope ladder with blood on her, half-torn shift, hair wild, and did not look down. Roose Bolton sent them away together later, with a sealed letter and a small escort of the very men who had watched the bear, as if he were washing his hands without soap. "Give my compliments to Lord Tywin," he said, bland. "Tell him Harrenhal is as he left it. He knows where the cracks are. He has always known." He did not look at Brienne. "You have done a service to Lady Catelyn," he said, flat. "You have also troubled my house. If you live to deliver your burden, it will be because the gods have decided to be amused by you." "Damn." Brienne tightened the straps on the saddle until the leather creaked. "I do not ask for amusement," she said. "I ask for a path. That is all any of us ask," Roose said, and turned away to be bled. At River Run the halls had that particular echo rooms get after a funeral, when the sound of an old man's cough has gone out of them and has not yet been replaced by anything else. Men talked too loudly for a few days, as if to fill the corners, and then too softly, as if they were afraid the corners would complain. Catelyn moved through them with her hands folded and managed a great deal of work by asking for cups of broth, and then putting the broth into someone else's hand. It was the kind of work women did, and that no one noticed until it was not done, and men found themselves cold. Roslin spent a morning with the steward and learned how much grain remained to be counted in the western granaries, and which river crossing had sprung a leak in the last rain. She spent an afternoon with Edmur's old hounds, and learned where the sewn mats had been placed over holes in the rushes to keep claws from finding splinters. She spent an evening with the Frey aunts, who had come to visit their girl and to make certain she had not been put in a corner and told to eat only once a day. After, when she reached the solar at the hour when the light makes even old tapestries look as if they have breath in them, Catelyn looked up and saw for the first time the way Frey blood and Stark company had begun to make another thing in the girl's face. Something not quite either. Something that watched and counted, and also waited to give more than it had been told to. "Lord Walder writes again," Roslin said, and kept her voice very even, as if it were a plank laid across a ditch. "He wants a daughter of his sixth son to be betrothed to Sir Perwyn's son, Perwyn who has no son. But he says he will mend that. He wants a counting of how many barrels of fish have been served to his grandchildren in this hall when they have visited. He wants to know if I am with child." She did not lower her eyes when she said it, and the courage of that small refusal made Catelyn love her suddenly, the way one loves a thing that has been found to be more solid than it looks. "What will you tell him?" Catelyn asked. "The truth," Roslin said, "and something else that will feel like truth to him. I will tell him that I am not with child, because I am not, and that it would please you if he sent the small harp that belonged to Aunt Amaray because it has a better tone than mine. And I will tell him that he shall have a list of other things when I have a list of them in my hand. He likes lists. He likes power, Caitlin said. He likes to count power, Roslin said. If I give him the counting, he may forget to add another column. That evening in council, Robb put a stone on Casterly Rock on the map and weighed it down with the hilt of a knife. While Tywin feeds his fat friends in King's Landing, he said, we will break his home. He will come back to defend his mother's bed, or he will lose it and remember the taste of humiliation forever. We will go by the Red Fork and through the hills north of the Gold Road. The Freys will cross at their own bridge and join us. Lord Jason Mallister will send what ships can be spared to Harry Lannisport, and Sir Brynden will take the Tumblestone up to the wind and burn their stores as he goes. When Lord Tywin turns, he will turn to ash. Die. Or he will not turn, Roose said, because that was his habit, to find the water in a man's plan. He may decide that a city is more valuable than a rock. A lion will pounce the thing that moves. We wrong him when we assume he is pride before sense. A lion is pride before anything, the Great John said, and slapped his big hand down so that cups jumped. I'll eat his golden piss pot while he watches. Do not eat anything of Tywin's, the Blackfish murmured. He salts his meats with poison the way other men use salt. Let the lion come back to his den to find the roof fallen. Edmure, who had held the forge with more sense than pomp for once in his life, flushed. If your grace had told me to let him pass, he said, I would have let him pass. I did what any lord at my river would do when a man in red and gold tried to ford it without permission. Then? You did well, Robb said, because it was true, and because he had learned that men did not always do well again when they did not hear it the first time. We needed Tywin East to break against his own family's vanity. Now we will use the result. Lord Frey will have his part. He looked to where lame Lothar sat with an expression as fixed as a well-cut piece of wood. Tell your father he will have the honor of the vanguard with my own banners at his side. Lothar inclined his head. My father appreciates remembrance, he said. He cherishes it. We will remind him again, Robb said, and Caitlin saw the flash in his eyes that meant he was thinking 3 moves beyond what he was saying. Lothar saw it too, and for a heartbeat his gaze sharpened, as if he had recognized a cousin in a crowd. They marched west into a heat that thickened like soup. Dust found their tongues and made mud. At night, men coughed over their own cooking fires and told stories shorter than they used to because there was not enough air. Roslin rode with Caitlin under a light hood and learned the Riverland names for small birds and for the kind of cloud that means rain now and not tomorrow. The Frey levy came in 2 big bites and 1 small one, each with its own master and each with its own causes for complaint. Lame Lothar salted them together with a dry efficiency that made Caitlin think of men building a wall in flood time. Black Walter scowled at the world and found reason to thump 3 men for small slights, each time in a place where men stood enough around him to see and carry the story. He did not thump a 4th. He watched Roslin once, as if measuring the distance between her wrist bones. She looked back long enough that he had to choose to look away rather than pretending the choice had not been his. They found Ashemark's outer holdings with only an old woman and 3 geese to protest. At Oxcross there were still bones under the thin new grass, and in the ruins of the crag the water had a taste like coins. The Westerlands had been taught earlier in the year to watch the horizon. Men looked at them from tree lines and saw a wolf, a fish, a bridge, a flayed man, and decided to obey the oldest instinct and hide. When they reached the Golden Tooth, sentries fled ahead calling out warnings that were prayers in another dress. Robb rode forward under a white flag because it is sometimes more frightening to show a man how sure you are. He offered terms because Ned Stark had always offered terms first. The garrison commander had a jutting jaw and the kind of eyes that had learned to measure stones. He looked at Grey Wind and then at the white flag and then down the road to where Frey banners were bobbing like the backs of hungry gulls. My wife is a Crakall, he said, very slow, as if we were telling a story to a child he did not trust to hear it properly. She has a garden with 5 apple trees. One of my daughters is sweet, and one is a horse. If I am a good soldier and die for a lion who is not here, will anyone teach my horse daughter not to bite the neighbor boy when he comes to the orchard for fruit? Will Lord Tywin come and say to her, girl, you must not bite? We have other children to teach to bite for us. Now, if you die for me, Robb said. Sober, I will teach your horse daughter to use her teeth properly. The man stared, then barked a laugh that turned into something like a cough, and then like a cry. He opened the gate in the morning. Caitlin thought not less of him for that, and when she saw him on the parapet, later with his wife and girls and apples in a bowl, she made a note of his name to remember and to put in some place in her where names of men who can see are kept. They moved past the tooth, the way water moves once the dam has cracked. Maker's holdfast opened for them. Nuns deep did not, and so was prized. They took Ashmark's outer wood and left men there who knew how to keep a wood. In Lannisport men closed their shutters when the word came that wolves were cutting the hills, and some took their jewels out of their hiding places and moved them to worse ones because fear makes men foolish. Jason Mallister's sails turned up on the horizon at dusk, thin as a promise, and just as dangerous. He did not have many ships, but he did not need many to set a fire in a harbor where men could see the flames from their beds. At night, Robb spread the map and set little stones upon little names, and Roslin sat with her hands around a cup and learned where Casterly Rock's posterns were and which old mines had sunk. There is a drain, the Blackfish said, touching a point with a nail. They emptied half the rock's chamber pots into the sea through it when I was a boy. It is not large enough for a man, or so the stories say. I have always distrusted stories that set convenient limits, Catelyn said. Or, Edmure put in with enthusiasm that had not yet quite learned to rein itself where men might trip on it. The caves south of Cornfield. The Smiths told me once that they run under half the rock if you have the right turnings. We could send a boy with a lantern. We could send a dozen, and the ones who come back will tell us. We could send a dozen, and the ones who come back will tell us which ways have air. We will not send boys, Roslin said. So mild it might have been mistaken for a courtliness, but with a steel bar set along its back. Men looked up without meaning to, because very soft sounds draw the ear when the hall is full of bigger ones. She did not blush at their notice. We will pay men who know those caves to tell us. There are miners who have worked them 3 generations. There are women who bring their husbands bread and hear their stories. There are old men who will take coin to talk about accidents that happened in 243 and 257, and again the year the summer nearly failed. They will know what a map cannot. Finding them will take time, Roose Bolton said. He toyed with a leech cup he had not yet brought to his lips. Our host eats while it waits. The rock has stood long, Robb said. It will stand 1 week more while we fetch the men who know where their chamber pots empty. In the Dreadfort, the smell of men was salted with the scent of raspberries, mashed for a lord's table. Theon tasted fruit once on the tongue that had been taught to call itself other names, and did not know whether someone had smeared sweetness there to make the next bitterness worse, or by accident, because hands are careless when they have already done their worst. Ramsay Snow fed his dog's haunch and laughed when they pulled it apart, and sometimes he watched Theon's mouth when he laughed, as if he enjoyed the way a man's lips tighten when he has learned they can be used against him. He had a kindness for things he could make into something else. Girls he could make into pretend boys to hunt with. Men he could make into pretend dogs. Names he could press until they cracked and sounded different. My father has written, Ramsay told Theon one day, when the air had a taste of rain and of blood left in a bucket. He says there are fashions in the South. He thinks I should learn them. Bendadarioi. Did he ask you to stop when men say the word? Theon said. His voice had frayed. It had a new sound in it, a thinness he did not recognize as his own. Ramsay smiled the way a man smiles when he has found a small new charm in his pocket, and is pleased to see it. He knows I cannot, he said. There are words that only wounded men know how to say. I would like to learn those. Theon learned then that there are prayers that are not words. He learned to keep his eyes open in the dark. He learned that when men tell you you are less than you were, they do it because they are afraid of what you have been, and of what you might be if you are permitted to be again. He learned to hate and to love the same thing at once, and that learning remade him in a way that no knife could. He thought of a boy with a wolf at his knee, and of a king's hand on his shoulder, and the memory burned like clean iron. White Harbor sent a slow, careful letter with flour on it. because everything from that city smelled of bread if you held it long enough. Lord Wyman wrote with a fat, elegant hand that apologized 3 times before it asked once. He spoke of ships, and of salt cod, and of winter taxes, and of his son Wylus, taken in battle long ago, who had not been returned. He asked if it might please the king to send envoys, not swords, so that bread might be broken, and the walls of his city measured. Between the fat flower words Catelyn read something else. The calculation of a man who would live to be 100 by learning how to be useful to whoever would still be standing at the end of the feast. He did not mention Freys. He did not need to. He had baked enough pies in his life to know how to name the meat without writing it down. "Send him Manderly his letters back, stamped with our seals," Robb said. "Send him a promise of ransom for Wylus if we take equivalent men. Tell him I do not ask a lord to starve his city for a song. Tell him we will come by land if he will not have us by sea. Tell him—" He stopped and smiled without humor. "No. Do not tell him more. He will fill in the rest with his own words, and they will be better than ours. Then see you." A raven beat down from King's Landing with a flash of green silk tied to its leg, the knot clever and frivolous at once. The hand inside was Cersei Lannister's, lazy and elegant, ink flourishes like the tails of cats. It thanked Lady Catelyn for her courtesy and her favor, and said that her son had been delivered to her by a large man with a sword and a face like an oath. It sent a lock of golden hair that could have been a child's or a woman's, and told the room at River Run that Sansa Stark had been wed to Lord Tyrion of House Lannister, in a ceremony most proper, and that she was now under the protection of the Iron Throne. At the bottom there was a fleuron, a little leaf drawn carefully. It was pretty. It made Catelyn want to bite it until the paper tore. Roslin folded the letter and refolded it until it had creases like a net. She did not raise her eyes. The hall did it for her. Edmure swore loudly, because there are men who always believe their swears are the thing that will mend the world. The great Joan's great hand crushed his cup, and blood ran down where the iron bit him, and he laughed because he would not give pain the courtesy of acknowledgement. Robb stood and did not fall. Catelyn saw the breath go into him and sit there and did not go out. And she wished she could take it and let it through her own lungs for him. "They have stolen my sister," he said at last. "They have stolen the North with a ceremony. They call it marriage and think that makes it less a theft. We will answer them with a stone in their mouth." "You cannot fight in King's Landing with wolves," Roose Bolton observed, mild as always. "You fight with words and with women's bellies and with food. They have eaten well lately." "Then we will starve them," Robb said. "We will starve the city from the rock. We will starve the Reach if we can. We will—" He stopped and looked at Catelyn and then away, as if he had remembered something he had promised himself not to say in her hearing. "We will get my sisters back," he said more quietly. And in that moment he was again the boy who had dropped a cup at supper and had been more ashamed of the noise than the mess. "I swear it." They made contact with men who had been sacked from the Rock's lower works after a cave-in 7 years past. They found a woman whose husband had mined copper in tunnels under the southern face until his leg had been turned wrong by falling timber. She came to the tent with a scarf pulled low and a mouth that would not say Tywin's name aloud. They paid her with coin because they could, and with dignity, because it was rarer. The Blackfish drew what she described on the parchment with a stick of char. It looked like a spider had decided to go mad, and then had remembered its duty and spun anyway. Beneath, Casterly Rock sat on its sea like a squat, cold god. 4 men at a time, the Blackfish said. Small men. The shafts narrow in places. They will go with rope and with food, and they will breathe only when the earth permits them. If we go fast, we will die. If we go slow, they will hear us. Roslin reached out a finger and did not quite touch the lines. "We cannot be the first to think of this," she said. "We are not," Sir Brynden said. "But most men who have thought of it have been killed trying to convince miners to light them in." "Then we will change the bargain," Catelyn said. "We will take their wives' names and write them in our book and swear by the heart trees and the 7 both, that if their men are lost doing this thing, the women will be fed from the king's table until they die of age and not hunger." Words on a page, Roos said almost kindly. Words that men's wives will bring to our door to make us keep, Catelyn said. Sometimes that is the only kind that work. In a canvas-thin night, she woke from a sleep that had not yet had time to turn sweet, and went out of the tent into air that had a taste of tin. On the slope below, men sat around small, careful fires and spoke the way men do when they know their words carry. Roslin stood with her cloak over her shift and her feet in the dew. When she turned, the moon made her eyes washed, her mouth small and pale. "I am with child," she said, without preface or apology, as if to make the words enough to fill the space between them. She did not put her hand to her belly. "I waited to tell you until the midwife had told me twice and made me hold her glass and watch the signs." She smiled then, in a startled way, as people smile when they have found a coin and do not yet know if it is counterfeit. "I suppose I am only a little with child, but it is the kind of little that grows." Catelyn felt the ache that had taken up residence beside her heart stir and swell into something not quite pain. She made herself breathe slowly, because there were things one could do that would make a child less likely to hold, and one of them was to cry too hard over it before it had hands. "You have told Robb?" Roslin shook her head. "Not yet. I wanted to tell his mother because his mother will help me tell him the right way, and will remind me that men can be frightened by joy as much as by loss." "Some more so," Catelyn said. She stepped forward and set her fingers very light on the girl's forearm, as if touching a bird. "We will tell him in the morning. We will put that news between this hall and the next, and it will give us another reason to cross. 3 times I have had good news in bad seasons. Sometimes the seasons listen. Sometimes they do not. But the good news has its own weight, whether or not anything else does." "Ben." Roslin nodded, and in that small nod was something like a curtsy to the future. Behind them down the slope, a man sang a snatch of song about a girl and a mill pond. The mill pond had wheels that turned and did not know why. In the morning, Robb kissed his wife on the brow and set his palm against her flat flesh, with a wonder he tried to hide, because there were Freys in the tent, and Karstarks had left, and the hall needed a king more than a boy. Lane Lothar watched and was moved enough by some echo of his own counting to look away. The Great John slapped Robb so hard on the back, he nearly knocked him into the map. Edmure stammered and then managed to recall a crude joke that made the room laugh for the pleasure of the release and not the joke. When all of that had been done and the tent emptied, Robb sat and put his head in his hands for 3 breaths. Catelyn stood behind him and set her palm on his hair. "I will make a world out of old rope," he said through his fingers. "I will make a bed out of it. I will make a bridge. I will make a cradle. If rope is all I have, I will make a cradle. Then let us pray the rope holds," Catelyn said, and did not tell him what mothers know and sometimes do not tell sons. That rope does not always hold, and that the world is made of breakage, and that still there are cradles. The miners went in like slow ants. They took little lights into the earth and made breathing a prayer. They tapped with hammers and then stopped when the stones sounded wrong. They tied a rope to each man like the bond between a mother and a child and counted out the length as he went until it was almost gone. And then they pulled, gently, and sometimes the rope came back slack, and sometimes it came back with a body that breathed through blood. The woman with the scarf waited with her hand pressed to her mouth and her eyes on the rope, and when it came back once with no man at the end, she did not weep. She set her hand on it and felt its fibers the way a woman will feel a child's braid when the child is sleeping. Catelyn stood with them during one of the pulls, and was there when the rope heaved, and a man tumbled out into the square of light like a fish into a net. He lay and coughed, and then grinned up at her through mud and said, "It stinks of lions." He drew in a breath of clean air as if it were sugar. "We found a place where a man might stand up and not crack his skull. It goes under and under. There is a place where the stone is thin." "Good," the blackfish said. "Very good. We will send the first 4 when the tide turns." At Harrenhal, Lord Bolton poured the leeches into the river and watched them writhe and flatten and go. Qyburn stood at his shoulder, hands folded. "They are hungry again," the leechmaster said. peering into his bowls. "It is the heat. It is always the heat," Roose Bolton said. He did not let the river see the shape of his reflection for longer than it took to confirm that it was where it had always been. He folded a letter from the twins back into its sheath and set his seal on it. It did not say anything that Walder Frey would not be able to read, even if it had been in cipher. It did not contain a promise. It contained a question. "What will you pay if I measure the king's neck for you?" He did not write it in blood because that would be vulgar. He wrote it in good ink. "You are too pale," Qyburn said. He smiled as if he meant the suggestion in a kindly way. "You should go into the sun." "I have never liked the sun," Roose said. His eyes drifted toward the west. "It shows too much." Brienne and Jaime reached King's Landing with a ragged escort and a smell that made beggars step aside, because even the poor know the stink of the road when it is mixed with the stink of punishment. At the gate, men in gold cloaks pretended they did not see the stump, because a city pretends what it does not want to know until it is forced to look. Jaime went up the Tower of the Hand with the look of a man who does not know whether he will laugh or strike his head on the lintel first. Cersei took him in with eyes that were mirrors, and then smashed. Tyrion came and stood to the side with his arms folded, and the careful expression of a man who has learned his face gives more away than his words. In a chamber below them, Sansa Stark dreamed of wolves without knowing it, and woke with her mouth full of cloth. In the west, under the rock, the first four went in. They were small men, 2 from the hills, and 1 who had been a dwarfish groom at a minehead before the flood took his father's breath, and 1 who had always been shorter than the others in his village, and had been kicked for it until he learned to duck. Each had a rope tied about his waist and a packet of oiled meat. Each had a tiny lamp. The Blackfish sat on the ground by the mouth of the kraal with his knees up and his hand on the rope as if he were playing at fishing. Roslin sat a little apart with 2 women. When the first rope jerked the smallest jerk, she flinched and then made herself still. Men watched her, because sometimes men need to see if there is a woman's stillness they can borrow. The first came back with a mouth like a man who has been kissed for the first time and cannot decide if he enjoyed it. "There's air," he said. "Thin. It smells of piss and of candles. There's a place where the rock has fallen and made a step. There's a sound like water under stone." The second did not come back for an hour. When he did, he vomited, then laughed and wiped his mouth with his filthy sleeve. "I heard singing," he said. "No words. Men have sung there so long they have worn the words off their song. We will go when the tide is out," the Blackfish said. "When the sea under the rock has turned her face. We will go with 12 and knives and rope. We will not sing." Robb slept for 2 hours and dreamed of Winterfell's yard with the sun on it and of Osha laughing. He woke with the knowledge that the world had been both bigger and kinder once when all that mattered was how to cross a stream without wetting your boots. He put on his cloak and went to the mouth of the tunnel where men crouched with their blades and their tight, silly grins, and his Blackfish sat on the ground like a boy about to run. Roslin came and set a hand on his arm and said nothing. He kissed her because there were things no counsel could teach a man. And one of them was when to collect his own courage from another person's mouth. They went down into the rock as if into the gullet of a beast. The air was sour and wet. It had a taste of iron that came from nowhere and everywhere. The light was a thing men carried in their hands and in their eyes. The ropes creaked. In places the stone sweated, and he put his palm to it and felt it cool as a dead thin skin. They went until a man could stand, and then until he could not again. They went until the lead man put his nose to the rock and sniffed and smiled as if at a remembered dish. "Candles," he whispered. "There are men who have eaten near here." They found a seam. They pried at it with a little iron. They went still when the stone spoke, and then the rock gave, silently, the way some stubborn men give suddenly after a day of refusing, and a slit of yellow appeared that was candlelight, and they were inside the rock. Men's voices are different in small spaces. They are higher, as if air makes them float, or lower, as if it drags them down. Robb put his mouth tight and made no sound, and laid his palm on the shoulder of the man ahead, and felt the small tremor in the muscle there, and kept it still by the pressing. He had never been in such close darkness with so many men, and known that any of them might be made suddenly into sound and ruin. He felt alive. so alive that a grief rose in him for all the times he had been less alive than this without knowing it. There is always a place in a fortress, no matter how well made, where a man does not think to look for a man. They found one, a little maintenance way by a cistern, where 2 keep boys in Lannister red had been sent to carry off piss water, and had left their buckets and a deck of greasy cards when the gong had rung in the distant kitchens. Robb's small men slid out of the seam and laid 3 knives along the dark. Robb stepped into the rock. He had the taste of candle grease in his throat, and the knowledge that if he spoke he might cough, and that would be the end of all he had done. "You men," a voice said. Not Lannister voice, but human. Tired, preoccupied, bored, the way a boy's voice always is when he has been given a chore and is thinking of something else. The blackfish went forward like water. 2 quick blows. 2 men sat down softly, as if they were being put into beds, and the path lay open, smelling of vinegar and fat. They moved through the rock's bowels with the confidence of thieves who have learned that the richest houses have in common a particular kind of carelessness. They counted steps. They marked turns with grease. They touched the walls to keep from weeping. They found the stair the miner's wife had told them of, and went up into a lower gallery where candles burned, and a guard snored with his head against a cask. The Great John would have killed him, because the Great John killed what was in front of him when it was the right size. The blackfish bound and gagged him, and shoved him behind the cask, and took the pins from the hinges of the door beyond, so that when it opened quietly. Dawn was dreaming over the sea when they came out into a lesser court, where a fountain wept into a cracked basin. A red lion hung limp in the still air. The rock muttered to itself as it always had, the way great old things do. Beyond, up 3 flights, the inner keep slept with one eye open. There were bells somewhere, very far off, in a village up the coast. The sound reached them as a kind of memory. Robb climbed the stair with 12 men and his blackfish. He moved with a quiet that had been beaten into him by weeks of being forced to plan instead of hit. At the first landing, a man in a nightshirt came out scratching and took 1 step and opened his mouth. The blackfish's hand found his throat. It was not the first throat that hand had found in the dark. It would not be the last. Time narrowed itself to a point and then widened again. By noon, the eastern barracks, the lower kitchens, and 2 of the stores were theirs. Jason Mallister's sails showed in the harbor like knife blades, thin and cold, and outside the walls dust rose where Freyhorse moved to make a racket just when the racket was needed. Lame Lothar made it with good will, which is to say without much feeling and with all the skill he had. Men went through the door in the cistern passage one at a time and became larger on the far side. They took a gatehouse. They took it by taking the men in it and holding them and making them sing the wrong song down into the yard when the man below shouted, and then they took him too with the rope that looked like a salute. At even, in the water kitchen, Robb stood with his back to a stone pillar, his sword loose, his hair damp with someone else spilled pail, and heard the rock begin to understand that something within it no longer obeyed it. The sound the rock made was not one sound but many. 100 men calling without seeing what they called at. A woman's scream when a forgotten door opened onto a face that was not a known one. The clatter of a pot fallen where no one expected the floor to tilt. He thought, in a corner of his mind that was not attending to anything important, that he now knew what it sounded like when a god took a breath. They did not own Casterly Rock by nightfall. Men who tell stories like that have not counted the stones or the ways blood runs along channels meant for rain. They had the lower works and 2 shafts and enough of the kitchens to eat while the people of the rock missed their supper. They had a way to bring in 50 men an hour, and if they could keep it, enough room to kill that many in 10 minutes if it went wrong. They had courage. In a tent outside, Roslin's hand went to her belly for the first time without her telling it to. She took it away again because she remembered that to touch a thing too much when it is new is to make it shy. Caitlin sat with a ledger and a cup, and added up flour, and salted beef, and turned a page when the numbers did not soothe her. Not because more numbers would be better, but because the act of turning a page is sometimes a thing the mind understands as progress. Lame Lothar wrote to his father, "The king is a man who counts when he fights." He did not add, I see you in him. Roose Bolton slept at midday and woke at dusk and sent a letter toward the west that said really only that he was loyal, and a letter toward the east that said really only that he was wise, and a letter toward the twins that said really only that he was patient. Qyburn watched his hands and never once forgot to hide his face. Theon Greyjoy dreamed of tar and of a woman's long hair in the rain, and woke with the taste of salt and of blood, and knew both were his own. In the yard of Casterly Rock, where a small shrine to the smith had been built by some pious foreman years ago, and then forgotten because the work had not pleased, the Blackfish took his helm off and leaned it against the plinth and washed his face in the basin. The water was warm from the day. He had never liked the Lannisters' god. He liked less their way of making devotions into taxes. He said nothing aloud because he was not a man who prayed where other men could hear him. He thought, just once, of a boy with a wooden sword in Riverrun's yard who had always insisted on doing the practice patterns twice because once felt like a lie. He smiled a little, which on his face was like a cloud changing its mind. Night set down and stayed. They held what they held. They slept in turns and ate in bites and tied ropes and untied them and listened for the particular name of footsteps that meant the wrong man was coming down the wrong stair. Above them, somewhere in the wealth of the rock, Lion's eyes stared at Lion's tapestries and did not blink. At dawn, because dawn always comes, the world outside the rock glowed and stirred, and in the tent where the king's map lay weighted with knives and river stones, Roslin drew a small fish in the corner with a bit of coal, because she had always drawn small fishes when she needed to breathe. She rubbed it out with her thumb before anyone came in, not because she was ashamed, but because she wanted it to stay in the place where it had been made, in her, where it would do her the most good. Caitlin came in and stood beside her and put her hand on the girl's shoulder. "E8," she said. "Then sit. Then count to 100. By the time you reach it, the news will have changed. When it changes, do not throw away the old numbers. We may need them." "Yes," Roslin said. She was learning how to put two lives in her mouth at once, wife and queen, girl and mother, Frey and Stark, and to chew without choking. The skill would be used, or it would not. The day did not care. The day asked that she do the next thing. It was enough. It had to be.